So a happy Sabbath again, everyone. It is for me a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. In fact, I don't know many of you, and you also don't know me. I've been in touch with Lauren. It's been a couple of years actually on Facebook. So every now and again we do exchange some messages, but yeah, we're still getting to know each other. So I'm happy to be here with you. I also, as a disclaimer, I would like to let you know that I'm not a scholar actually. So I'm a pastor, but I'm not a scholar. So do not expect that this will be a deeply scholarly presentation. It could be a little bit scholarly, but it's not going to be very scholarly. But I do hope that it's going to be food for thought for you. As a pastor who started a couple of years ago, this is a topic that actually has been part of my ministry, and I have been reflecting about it. And this is actually what led me to do this research on the theme. Was actually very personal. I wanted to know more, and that's how actually I started this research about the Lord's Supper. So, as you see, the title of the presentation is The Lord's Supper or The Lost Supper. It's a little bit provocative, but I think it's going to become evident to you in the course of the presentation. What do I mean with it? Okay, so let's see if I do not manage to. Oh, okay, I should click here, I guess. Yeah. So this presentation is divided into four parts. In the first part, we're gonna do a short semantic analysis. So what does the Bible say about the Lord's Supper? We're gonna analyze this expression. In the second part, we're gonna make a hermeneutical analysis. So comparing a little bit the texts related to the Lord's Supper in the Bible. The third part, we're going to make a historical analysis. So we're going to look, as the title also suggested, it stretches from the first to the third century. And then in the fourth part, I share my conclusions. And I also have some questions for you. So you may ask questions to me, but first I also have some questions for you. And these are questions for us to think about, to discuss about. So the semantic analysis, the Lord's Supper, it's a Greek term, kyriakon deiton. The interesting thing about this Greek expression is that it occurs only once in the whole Bible. So this is actually as a title of introduction. Oh, very interesting, because the Lord's Supper is so important in the Christian tradition, but this expression, as it is, the Lord's Supper, only occurs once in the whole Bible, and the text is actually in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20, which says, "So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat." And the interesting thing here is that Paul actually even uses the expression in a negative context. So he is reproaching the church for not celebrating the Lord's Supper as they should. But there are also some direct biblical references to the Lord's Supper. They do not use the same wording, but we do know that Paul is talking about the Lord's Supper. For instance, in the previous chapter of Corinthians, chapter 10, we find three expressions that refer to the Lord's Supper. Paul talks about the cup of blessing in verse 16. He talks about the cup of the Lord in verse 21, and the Lord's table also in verse 21. So actually, these are the direct references to the Lord's Supper we have and they are all in these two chapters of First Corinth. Now, the word that interests us here is the word deipnon, which is the word that appears in First Corinthians 11. And this word occurs only 8 times in the Bible. So this word for supper, deipnon, the Lord's Supper. Now, deipnon, in the biblical times, in the first century, both in Israel, in Palestine, and in the surrounding countries, was the word referred for the main meal of the day. We're going to look here, these 8 references to the word supper, deipnon, in the Bible. The first one we find is in Mark chapter 6, verse 21, when he wrote, "Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet." There is the word deipnon, for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. So deipnon there in this text of Mark is translated as a banquet. Then we have a second one is Luke chapter 14 from 12 to 14, when then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon, which could be translated as dinner, or a dinner, which there is translated actually as a banquet also, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet," and that's another word for feast, "invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Then we have a couple of more verses in the New Testament. In Luke chapter 14, verse 16, Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet," that there is the word there also for supper, deipnon, "and invited many guests." Then we have in John 12, verse 2, "Here a dinner, deipnon, was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him." Then we have Revelation 19, verse 9. "Then the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb." And he added, "These are true words of God." And then the last verse is Revelation 19, verse 17. "And I saw an angel standing in the sun, who cried in a loud voice to all the flying birds in midair, 'Come gather together for the great supper of God.'" And then we have the other 2 verses, which are in First Corinthians, the text that we actually read. So here, a preliminary conclusion from this semantic analysis. In all these verses, deipnon describes a banquet, a dinner, or a feast. Furthermore, biblical and extra biblical ancient literature indicates that deipnon was considered the main meal of the day. So the meal that people ate at dinner time. It is the same word that is used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, 20, and 21 to describe the Lord's Supper. Therefore, when we look at the semantics, the biblical evidence is that the Lord's Supper was actually an actual meal, or we could even say a substantial meal, as as this word was used to describe the main meal of the day. Sorry. Yeah. Now we're going to look at the hermeneutical task, which we're going to look at some indirect references. So up to now, we have looked at the direct references to the Lord's Supper, and now we're going to look at the indirect references and check actually if this match. So the word, the expression "kalase tu ortu," the breaking of bread. We find this expression 3 times in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 2:42, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayer. An interesting detail about this verse, I've heard actually many sermons where pastors say that these are actually the 4 practices of the early church. But it's interesting because when we look in the original text, the text does not describe 4 practices, but only 3. So the text is talking about the apostles' teaching and fellowship, and then it doesn't have a conjunction and. It says to fellowship, the breaking of bread. So their fellowship and breaking of bread are connected. These are connected to 1 practice instead of 2. And then prayer is the 3rd practice. So this is quite interesting because the breaking of bread implies actually fellowship. These 2 practices are connected to each other. Then we also have Acts 2:46. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. And then we have Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. Now, the question here is, are these indirect references to what we know as the Lord's Supper? So the breaking of bread and the Lord's Supper. Then we come to Corinthians. So then when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. Then 1 Corinthians 11:33. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together. Despite not being clear about the frequency, the wording used by Paul suggests that the church met regularly to eat the Lord's Supper. So it is not very clear. In fact, many Christians, they struggle to know how often we should celebrate the Lord's Supper because there is not really a strong indication in the New Testament about the regularity or the frequency in which the early church met to celebrate the Lord's Supper if we search for the wording the Lord's Supper. Nevertheless, when we compare the breaking of bread with the Lord's Supper, then we do have more evidence about the frequency with which the church met. Thus, on the other hand, in Acts, Luke is clearer regarding the frequency in which the church met to break bread. It says sometimes on a daily basis, or it could be also on a weekly basis. So the texts in Acts chapter 2 seems to suggest that they met on a daily basis, and the text in Acts chapter 20 seems to suggest that it was on a weekly basis. Now, could it be that Paul and Luke are referring to the same meal, but using a different wording? So we're going to check that. In order to answer this question from the biblical perspective, we actually have to look already at the first historical evidence. So we're going to have to make a historical analysis. The oldest document we have, which records or which have some references to what we consider now the Lord's Supper, is actually the Didache. Now, the Didache was found is a manuscript that was found in Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the 19th century. As they researched the document and the Greek that was used, they first concluded that it was written around the second century AD. But further analysis actually indicates that this document, the Didache, most likely it is a document from the end of the first century. So probably around the same time that John wrote the Gospel or the Book of Revelation, the Didache pertains. In fact, there was even some discussion about including the Didache in the biblical canon, but they decided not to include the Didache in the biblical canon because it sounded too Jewish for the Christians in Nicaea. So this is why they decided to let it apart. But as we read, so we have three references in the Didache about the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, or the breaking of bread, as we will see. The first one is in chapter 9, which says, now concerning the thanksgiving or Eucharist, the word Eucharist simply means thanksgiving. Thus give thanks. First, concerning the cup, we thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. And concerning the broken bread, we thank you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. For yours is the glory and power through Jesus Christ forever. But let no one eat or drink of your thanksgiving, but they who have been baptized into the name of the Lord. For concerning this also the Lord has said, give not that which is holy to the dogs. So this is chapter 9 of the Didache. And then when we come to chapter 10, it is very interesting how chapter 10 starts, because it starts with the following wording. But after you are filled, thus give thanks. So we thank you, Holy Father, for your holy name, which you caused to tabernacle in our hearts, and for the knowledge and faith and immortality which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. You, Master Almighty, created all things for your name's sake. You gave food and drink to men for enjoyment, that they might give thanks to you. But to us, you freely gave spiritual food and drink and life eternal through your servant. Before all things, we thank you that you are mighty. To you be the glory forever. Remember, Lord, your church, to deliver it from all evil and to make it perfect in your love, and gather it from the four winds, sanctified for your kingdom, which you have prepared for it. For yours is the power and the glory forever. Let grace come, and let this world pass away. Hosanna to the Son of David. If anyone is holy, let him come. If anyone is not so, let him repent. Maranatha, Amen. But permit the prophets to make thanksgiving as much as they desire. Okay. Yeah. So, another partial conclusion. As we read the text of the Didache, two aspects are remarkable to us. The first is that there is no mention of the body and blood of Jesus as symbols of the bread and the wine. This is actually quite remarkable if we think about it, because they were meeting to celebrate the Lord's Supper or Thanksgiving. but they do not use that formula that we see in First Corinth about referring to Jesus' body as the bread and to Jesus' blood as the cup. So that is quite remarkable as we read the Didache. The second remarkable aspect is that chapter 10 starts by saying, after you are filled, thus indicating that at the time the Didache was written, Christians still celebrated the Lord's Supper as a normal meal instead of a merely symbolic one. So they ate until they were filled. They did not eat a symbolic food as we eat when we celebrate the Lord's Supper nowadays. They ate until they were filled. Another interesting detail in the Didache regarding the Lord's Supper or the Thanksgiving is that it was celebrated on a weekly basis. Then chapter 14 of the Didache says, but every Lord's Day, gather yourselves together and break bread. So here we see that expression of acts, to break bread, and give thanksgiving after having confessed your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure. But let no one who is at odds with his fellow come together with you until they be reconciled, that your sacrifice may not be profaned. For this is that which is spoken by the Lord. In every place and time offer to me a pure sacrifice. For I am a great king, says the Lord, and my name is wonderful among the nations. So the Didache only makes this quote. I searched for it, and it's actually an indirect quote from Malachi chapter 1, verse 11. So these are remarks about the Didache. Now we can conclude up to this point. If the meal described in the Didache is indeed the Lord's Supper, as it is referred in Acts in chapters 9 and 14 as break bread, then it could be that the breaking of bread referred in the book of Acts is actually the Lord's Supper. The difference would be that Luke named it the breaking of bread, whereas Paul named it the Lord's Supper. And another interesting element here is that the Christians who met together to celebrate the Lord's Supper in the Didache, they also did not refer to the elements, the bread and the wine, as Jesus' body and blood. Then we have another historical evidence about how the Lord's Supper was celebrated in the following centuries. It is the fractio panis paintings. So the fractio panis is actually Latin. It means breaking of bread in Latin. The fractal paintings were discovered in the second half of the 19th century. So it's interesting because the Didache and these paintings in Rome were found around the same time. But this was found by a Jesuit historian called Joseph Wilpert. Wilpert and his team were making archaeological excavations in Rome when they discovered the paintings. Most of these paintings are in the catacomb of Priscilla. The paintings are believed to portray the practices of Christians who lived in the city between the 2nd and the 4th century. So they do not know for sure, but they do know that these paintings were made between the 2nd and the 4th centuries AD. So here is the first painting. In this first picture, we see 7 people, one of whom is a woman. The one that is reclined is believed to be a woman, although some Catholic theologians, they deny that it was a woman, but many people who interpret the painting, they do say that it was a woman. And there is a cup nearby. So we can see here a cup, and one plate contained 5 loaves of bread. So here we see one plate. It looks even fear, but some specialists say it's actually 5 loaves of bread. And then on the other plate, we see here actually what looks like 2 fish. So probably the intention of the Christians who made this painting was to replicate the multiplication of the fish and the bread. We even see here on the sides the baskets. So 7 baskets with bread. But many people actually say, yes, it is a reference to the multiplication of fish and bread, but it also portrays a Christian celebration of the Lord's Supper. Some people say the agape feast. Many people say this agape feast, the Lord's Supper, and the breaking of bread were actually one and the same celebration. And then we have here another painting, which is also in the same catacomb, the catacomb of Priscilla. So here again, we see 7 baskets of bread. So just as it is also described in the gospel, again, we see here more clearly 2 fish on the table, 2 fish. And then we see here which something that looks like bread, and I cannot see also clearly, but the specialists, they do say there is also a cup here at the table. And actually, if we go back, what lead many people to believe that it was a celebration of the Lord's Supper is actually the presence of the cup at the table as well, because we know when Jesus multiplied the fish and the bread, there was no mention of a cup. And then, since here in the paintings a cup do appear, some people conclude that it is a reference to the Lord's Supper or an agape feast as well. So the question then is, when did the Lord's Supper became a ritualistic and more symbolic meal? Because as we have seen so far, the evidence we see from the Bible and from the Didache and even the Fracture Panis paintings is actually that the Lord's Supper was an actual meal, and it was not as ritualistic as it is nowadays. So when did it become more ritualistic? It is not a very friendly time to talk about Russians, but there is a Russian theologian called Valery Alekin, and he actually wrote an interesting article. So for those who are interested in the article, you can read it actually for free online. You just have to quote the title. It's more than 50 pages, but it's a quite interesting research he made. And he argues that the change took place somewhere around the middle of the 3rd century. Cyprian points out what he sees as the difference between the 2 Sunday meals of the Christian community. So, up to the 3rd century AD, there were actually 2 Eucharistic meals, as it was. The Eucharistic celebrated in the morning, the Sacrificium Matutinum, and the celebrated in the evening, the Cena or Convivium Nostrum. In his view, from Cyprian, the difference is that the Eucharist in the morning, the community as a whole, omnis fraternitas, is present, whereas for logistical reasons, the evening supper is only attended by some of the members of the community. For this reason, Cyprian said, the true sacrament is the one we celebrate in the presence of the entire congregation. Here we witness how the Eucharistic ritual in the morning is considered the main sacrament of the Christian Sunday, while the Sunday evening meal which was originally the only and had subsequently the more significant rite of the Christian community, is given less importance. And then he adds that in the first half of the 3rd century, besides the communion meal supper on Sunday evening, Eucharistic celebrations were incorporated into the prayer meetings held in the early morning. In these early morning sessions, the meal could not be and did not need to be as substantial as in the evening. The portions of food and wine used in the morning service were probably less sizable than those provided at the supper on Sunday evening. As a result of practical constraints, the Eucharistic in the morning was probably ritualized to a certain extent. At the same time, owing the growth of the Christian communities and the proliferation of the morning services, the supper on Sunday evening began to lose importance and recognition as a sacrament, whereas the Eucharist celebrated on Sunday morning and the morning of other days gained significance. This development resulted in the morning ceremony being regarded as the real sacrament, while the Sunday supper gradually ceased to be considered Eucharistic, and as such became a charity meal for the less well-off members of the community. So, just to explain here, originally the main gathering was in the evening, but at some point, people started to gather also for a morning service, a prayer morning service, which also offered food, so also offered an Eucharistic or a Thanksgiving meal, but it was less sizable for practical constraints. And this meal from the morning, started to be ritualized to a certain extent. However, at some point, the morning services became actually the main service of the day, and it was proliferated. And the evening service lost importance, and it was attended by the poor people of the community. So for this reason, they kept the more sizable meal, the more substantial meal in the evening for the less well-off members of the community. And it was seen as a sort of charity meal, whereas the Eucharist, the sacramental Eucharist, was served in the morning, and it was ritualized, and the food then gained more theological significance, if we could put it that way. Now, I have here just a brief comment because I think we have to touch on this. So the Lord's Supper in the Reformation period and the Adventist pioneers. Interestingly enough, the 1500 reformers mostly addressed theological aspects regarding the Lord's Supper, such as transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and memorialism. Nevertheless, the form in which the Lord's Supper should be celebrated was not addressed by the Reformers nor the Adventist pioneers. This actually is quite interesting because very often when we have doubts, especially traditional Adventists, we go to the pioneers, we go to Ellen G. White, but interesting enough, Ellen G. White does not write very much about the Lord's Supper. Her most extensive treatment of the subject is found in her book Desire of Age, chapter 72, In Remembrance of Me. However, she does not say anything about the form in which the early church celebrated it, nor how we should celebrate it nowadays. So she basically talks about the importance of the Lord's Supper, but she doesn't talk in pragmatical terms about the Lord's Supper, more on theological terms. White does not mention that the Lord's Supper, White does mention that the Lord's Supper was replaced the Passover feast, which, according to her, passed over forever. This was also a shock to me because, as a Brazilian, this Easter is very much a strong tradition, and even Adventists in Brazil, we do celebrate Easter or Passover. But Ellen G. White actually says that the Passover was replaced by the Lord's Supper, which passed away forever. So, a quite strong statement. The question is, if the Lord's Supper replaced the Passover feast, why did the early church celebrate it weekly or even daily instead of yearly? Because Passover was celebrated yearly. So why the one replaced the other, and we do not celebrate the Lord's Supper on a yearly basis, but in the Adventist church, at least, quite often on a quarterly basis. Additionally, Paul seems to suggest that the early church kept celebrating the Passover feast in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8. However, having Christ, our Passover lamb, as the center of the celebration. So Paul says there in 1 Corinthians, let us keep the feast. So it is very clear language. And he does seem to indicate that the early church did celebrate the Passover, but now having Jesus, having Christ as the motive of the celebration. So here my conclusion, and after that I have some questions. As I attempted to demonstrate in this presentation, an important aspect of the Lord's Supper was lost throughout history. When carefully analyzed, the biblical evidence indicates that the early church celebrated the Lord's Supper as an actual meal. So, not a symbolic meal as we celebrate nowadays, but an actual meal. Moreover, Paul's indication that the church met regularly to celebrate the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, 20, and 33, in connection with the breaking of bread texts in the book of Acts and in the Didache, seem to indicate that the Lord's Supper and the breaking of bread were actually the same meal. Finally, historic evidence shows that around the first half of the 3rd century, the meal started to lose its literal form and became more ritualized, placing more emphasis on the theological benefits of the emblems, that's the bread and the wine, instead of its original communion emphasis. So as we read the text in Acts and in Corinth, the emphasis of the Lord's Supper was the communion, was for the people to be fed, was for the believers to connect with one another. At least that's what the text suggests. But with the change around the 3rd century, the emphasis was placed on the elements instead of the communal aspect of the meal. Someone has aptly noted, so I read this sentence in the Adventist Forum of Pastors and some time ago, and I kept it with me and I saved it. I do not know who wrote this, but I found it a very apt and a very strong sentence. So it says, we have turned a substantial meal with a symbol into a symbolic meal with a substantial symbol. So it's quite interesting as it is put. So the meal was substantial, and yes, it did have a symbol for the church, but now the meal is not substantial anymore. It's just symbolic, but the symbol became substantial to the meal. So we turned it around. And then here I have some questions. Is the form in which we celebrate the Lord's Supper important? To illustrate this, do we consider the form in which we baptize new believers important? The most common argument to baptize by immersion is that the word baptism means immersion. I have been part of many debates, and we always point to people who believe in baptism by sprinkling of water. We say yes, but baptism means immersion. So it means you have to be immersed under water. However, the word for supper means banquet, but we do not make the argument that it should be a banquet. We say, yes, it can be symbolic. So I find that contradictory. Additionally, we always point to the fact that in the Bible, when people were baptized, it was always by immersion. If the Greek word for the Lord's Supper also means banquet or dinner, why do we not make a case that a real meal should be served when we celebrate the Lord's Supper instead of a merely symbolic one? Would we consider a symbolic baptism also valid? The second question: if there would not be a problem in the Corinthian church, Paul would not have written about the Lord's Supper. Thus, why does Paul mention Jesus' body and blood in the text? Was he giving a ritualistic formula to be followed as we celebrate the Lord's Supper? So this is actually the church handbook recommend that every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper, that we quote from First Corinthians, that which became for us like a formula to celebrate the Lord's Supper. However, I wonder if, because Paul is addressing the egoism in the church, he says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you celebrate, because some families, they go ahead with their own meal and they do not wait for the other families, which some theologians say were less well off. And then he says, some people go drunk and other people go hungry. And this is Paul's critic to the church. And then my question here is, was Paul giving us a formula, or was he quoting Jesus' selfless attitude of giving himself, his body and his blood for us, in order to correct the egoistic practice of the Corinthian church? I'm not sure whether this is clear to you, my reasoning here, but if it's not, you can ask me. Then the second question, the third, for Paul, leaving the meal drunk was just as problematic as leaving the meal hungry. He says that. However, nowadays, we all leave the meal hungry. Why is it no longer considered a problem? So, people who drank too much or ate too much, it was considered a problem. But also people who didn't drink or who didn't eat. And I always find it, and actually, what prickled me to study this subject more in depth was that after we celebrated the Lord's Supper in one of my churches, and then when I was talking to people at the door, someone says, "Oh yes, we're gonna go home now to eat." And I found it very contradictory, because if we celebrated a supper in church, why we go home hungry? Because that's precisely what Paul is criticizing in the Corinthian church. So if we celebrate a meal in church, we shouldn't have to go home in order to eat a real meal. The Lord's Supper should actually be an actual meal. Then, next question: do the current form, mainly cognitive, in which we celebrate the Lord's Supper, foster real fellowship in the church? So my question here is, so basically, because we are focused in the current way in the emblems, in the elements, it is mainly cognitive. Does this mainly cognitive form in which we celebrate foster fellowship in the church? As we read the text in both in Corinth and in Acts, fellowship was important. And my question is whether it does foster fellowship the way we are celebrating it now. And then next question, what is the difference between a sacrament and an ordinance? Do not most people, even Protestant churches, still consider the Lord's Supper a sacrament, despite claiming it is merely an ordinance? Do the form, this with symbolic food, and the spirit, ritualistic, in which we celebrate the Lord's Supper, foster the belief that it is a means of grace? Does the word sacrament means of grace? So, in theory, that's what Catholics believe, that when you take part in the Lord's Supper, you receive grace from God. Most Protestants, they see the Lord's Supper as an ordinance, not as a sacrament. But I wonder if in practice, that's not actually what most people experience. That is, despite using the word ordinance, it is perceived as a sacrament by most people. And then last question, can we still do something nowadays to restore or enhance our celebration of the Lord's Supper? Thank you very much for your attention. And now we are to the questions, whether you may or you want to answer the questions, or you may ask me questions. So Linda will be mediating that.
Yes, I would, Pastor Reis, I would suggest that for now that you remove your PowerPoint questions, but we may ask you to put them back up again. So
Yes, no problem.
let's start with that. Well, I'm fascinated, and I'm sure others are as well, just based on the conversations I've seen in the chat. And so, Lauren, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, happy to. I'm fascinated by this history. There's just all kinds of stuff here. I had to go and do a little side research on the Didache. I've heard of it, but I had never really looked into it very much. And that is fascinating. It actually was rejected by some of the early church fathers as part of the canon, but there are still some churches that keep it in their holy books. Ethiopian Orthodox, I think, still keep it probably sort of a little bit like the Catholics regard the Apocrypha. But it was your second to last question that really interested me. Ordinance. Ordinance means a demand, a command. It's a rule. It's something you must do. We have a city ordinance that you have to have a sidewalk in front of your house in this neighborhood, or that sort of thing. And yet, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, here's an interesting little thing, Marcelo. When we finish up the bread and the wine, we're given very specific instructions that we have to burn the bread and pour out the wine. And I've actually been in pastors' meetings where pastors discussed with great enthusiasm their methods of burning the bread and making a fire in the backyard so they could burn the leftover bread as though it's something holy. And I don't think they see the conflict there. In your research, did you find anything to indicate at what point? I mean, clearly, it seems very clear to me that this was a real meal, it was a fellowship dinner. But do you find anything to tell you where the Catholic formula, the visible means of invisible grace for the bread and the wine, where that came into being was it, you mentioned up to the 3rd century, was it before or after that point? Where did it become something so that the medievalists could say, the medieval church could say, okay, we're going to deny the we're going to deny the Lord's Supper for this whole country because you're not being good Catholics. And everybody was alarmed because they couldn't get the means of grace. Everybody was going to be lost if they died during that time. Uh, do you know when that transition happened?
No, not necessarily. As I pointed out, it also the change. It seemed very much organic, also, and it was not like a concilium of Nicaea or a church gathering that determined from now on this is how we're going to see the Lord's Supper or how we're going to celebrate the Eucharist. It was mostly logistic. So people started to attend more the morning service and which had less food. And that's how it became more ritualized. And that grew actually in the practice of the church. So as I saw in my research, it was a very organical development, the change from an actual meal to a more ritualized meal. And whether the Catholic Church misused it to like punish a group in the Middle Ages, I wouldn't doubt it happened, but it is not in my knowledge whether they have done it.
Oh, they did. I mean, that was a common thing to say, okay, this region is not going to is going to be under punishment, and so nobody gets to have the sacrament in this area. That's historical. I don't know how often it happened, but it did happen. I'm just curious at what point people said, I've got to have that holy bread and wine, or I'm going to lose everything, because that does not appear to be the case in the New Testament.
No, definitely not. And as I mentioned, even in the Didache, what I also found very interesting is that that formula, which it grew as a formula for us nowadays, but it is also a question that I ask whether Paul is mentioning Jesus there in 1 Corinthians 11 as an example of selflessness instead of as a formula. Because nowadays we quote the text as a formula. So we are not interested in the selflessness of Jesus about
Yes.
giving. So Paul is criticizing people because they do not share their food. And then Paul says, do you remember that Jesus gave his body and his blood, and you are not willing to share your food with one another? So that's actually how I read the text. But as it is read nowadays, it is mostly like, no, this is a formula we have to apply as we celebrate the meal.
Right. I thought your phrase that it went from actual and material to cognitive, I think is the word you use. That's a good description. Thank you.
Well, and Lauren, I suspect as a pastor, you more than others would appreciate that in today's world, all the pastor has to do is announce that communion will be held the next week, and the attendance will drop by a substantial number.
That's
As
right.
and I'm not sure to what we attribute that, but in any case, I've seen it in my own church. But Jerry, I'm going to come to you, but if you'll forgive me, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of one of our members who was unable to ask it herself, and that is this. So, Pastor Reis, if you don't mind, can you tell us when foot washing was included into the ceremony and how that came to pass, and historically, what we should know about that?
Um, as far as I know, at some point, I also do not know when it was included, but the Catholics do practice the foot washing as they celebrate Easter, actually. But as far as I'm concerned, it is not the whole congregation. So it is the priester who washes the feet of someone of the community or of another priester, but as an example. But as far as I'm concerned, someone may correct me if you have more knowledge. It is not the whole congregation which participates. I have read something, but also not into depth, that some Protestants at the time of the Reformation, they started actually practicing the foot washing. And I believe that we Adventists inherited it probably from the radical Protestants, so the Anabaptists or another group. But this is also something that I have to further research. But I do know that the Catholic Church practices it once a year with Easter celebration, but not the whole congregation as we do. And some Protestant groups also, and I do believe we inherited the practice from some Protestants, probably the Anabaptists or another group.
It's interesting too to me, having been a baptized Seventh-day Adventist for more than 60 years, that when I first became an Adventist and was baptized with my mother, that the foot washing had an element included with it, which seemed to make it a much more spiritual type of ceremony, in that before one partook of the foot washing, one was to go and seek out someone in the congregation with whom one might have had an argument or a disagreement, that there was to be a healing or a mending of offenses, so to speak, and that would be the way that the assignments would be made. That if you went and found it, of course, it had to be women with another woman, but it did seem to include or incorporate more of that social or communal type of sense to it than just an individual action.
Yeah, it is quite interesting because I shared this presentation with my colleagues here at my conference, and the responses I got from my colleagues, it's actually that in our Lord's Supper celebration, the foot washing is actually more appreciated than the Lord's Supper itself, precisely because of this relational element. So, although the foot washing, we still can argue that it is not. So the dynamics that men should do it with men or women with women or married couples, and it should be all apart, and whether you should seek someone in church where you had, so an argument or you were at odds with. So I think that has to be corrected. But the foot washing does have actually a relational and communion element, which we are actually missing in the Lord's Supper. So in some sense, the foot washing is more relational, but I do believe that even the way we do the foot washing, it could be improved. And another point is that Jesus instituted, or well, we don't know if he instituted, he did say, follow my example. So we don't know if he was instituting the foot washing. But I would couple that actually with Easter or with the Passover celebration. But I do not see the need, because I do not believe, as I read the texts in Acts or in Corinth, I do not think they practice the foot washing every time they would eat with one another. So I do think if we would practice the foot washing as we celebrate, particularly for, there was a relevance in those days with the dusty roads, and in the context, it made a lot of sense. I do think personally that, for us nowadays, washing someone's feet could be humbling in a way. So it is something that we can learn something from, But it's for us different in meaning. So this is why I would make a case that we could still celebrate the foot washing, but mostly as we celebrate actually Easter or Passover, then every time that we celebrate the Lord's Supper, because I do not see the connection there. But that's personal, and it is speculative as well, because we do not have scriptural evidence about that. But it was instituted when Jesus celebrated his last meal.
Mhm. Well, I can tell you, Pastor, with no disrespect, that men cannot fully appreciate the cultural evolution of foot washing, because when I was a young girl, the reason why it had to be segregated is because women had to take off hosiery in order to be able to unclothe their feet, as it were. And then when the invention of pantyhose, we just washed right over that. And today I live in Florida and nobody wears hosiery. So you can see the evolution of this process, uh, for better or for worse. I don't know, but it
Mhm.
certainly illustrates
Right.
what has happened for women over time. But my friend Jerry, I'm glad to see you today. Did you have to tell the children's story in church today? Jerry, I don't have you as being muted, but I can't hear you. Is your microphone on?
Is that better?
Yes, sir.
I had my microphone muted too. I didn't tell the children's story today, but I did bake fresh blueberry muffins for my Sabbath school class.
There you go. Good man, Charlie Brown.
Thank you. So, Pastor Reyes, I think that taking this back to only Jesus and then Paul's instructions to the Corinthians misses something that I think Jesus intended that we remember. And I think that's the connection to Passover. Now, Passover became the Day of Atonement, right? After the Jews were established, they continued this on an annual basis as part of the celebration of the sanctuary. So if I miss all of that, I'm simply going back to a meal that Jesus had with his disciples, in which, by the way, he said, I'm not going to drink wine ever again until I can do it again with the rest of you, because I like wine so much. I tell that to my children. They seem to love that. But to come back to my point, I think that we can enhance the Lord's Supper by rejuvenating some of what it was and must have been to Jesus and his disciples. I mean, I'm a vegetarian, but for this circumstance, I think I would eat lamb if we had it. Later on, they added the bitter herbs, but I think that reinstituting it as the Passover has a lot more benefit. And frankly, I would love to see us integrate this as an after-church potluck in the same sentiment that Jesus and his disciples had, with or without foot washing. And that to me brings us back to, well, how often? Because that is a big deal to me in discussion. If this is Passover, how often did we do it? Once a year. Very special. And I think by doing it more often, to answer Ed Reifschneider's question earlier, Ed, you should wake up. I think having it only once a year might deepen our understanding and spiritualization of the entire process. What do you think, and how does that read into what you've studied?
Yes, that's I love to comment on that, because that's something also that I'm busy with my churches, and I really appreciate that. I propose to my churches that we celebrate Passover this year as a Seder meal.
Yes.
So a cedar meal is actually the complete meal with bitter herbs and everything. And I a couple of years ago I watched a presentation of a messianic Jew on YouTube, and he actually presents how the Jews, they celebrate a Seder meal, but then by the end of the meal, he actually introduces what makes that celebration Christian. And it's
Yeah.
very interesting, Gerald, because when we read the Gospels, we have very strong evidence that the Last Supper was actually a Seder
Yeah,
meal.
exactly.
In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three Gospels say, and as they were eating, Jesus took a bread.
Right.
And as they were eating, he took a cup.
Right.
And Luke even mentions Jesus taking a second cup. So in a Seder meal, actually, they drink 4 times from the cup. And they eat the bread different several times as well. So, but of course, each cup has a symbolism. So the liberation of Egypt from the plagues, for the pardon of sins, and so on. And then you build up and you come to the liberation we received from Jesus. And that is so beautiful as they do it. And I ask myself, why we do not do that? They even have a special place for the children in the celebration, where the children have to seek for the afikomen, so which is a piece of bread which is hidden or it is put in a grave. And that is actually a symbolism of people looking for Jesus in the grave. And that's actually where the children are involved in the celebration. So I'm very excited because this year we're going to do that with our churches, with my churches here. And I'm very excited because I think this is going to be very beautiful and this is going to be so meaningful. And this will be actually, for me, like a real Lord's Supper because it's going to be also an actual meal. Nobody will go home and say, we're still hungry.
I
So
love
we're gonna have a rich spiritual celebration which will incorporate the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, and it's gonna be very rich. So I'm really looking forward to that. And to answer your question, I do think so. We could celebrate Passover, as I'm suggesting, in this way, but of course, having Jesus as the motive at the center. But actually, and that's actually what I suggested, it can sound very heretic, but what my presentation points in the direction is that the Lord's Supper was not a ritualistic meal, it was a communal meal. It sounds very heretic, but it looks a lot like the potlucks
Yes.
we have in our churches nowadays. Um, because even, I mean, in the text of the Didache, so they say grace, those thanksgiving for the bread
Mhm.
and for the wine,
Right.
but they eat up until they are filled, and it is not ritualistic. Of course, the element there is mostly communion. So in the text, in the Didache, this is why they have a concern that you are not at odds with your brother. Or even another interesting element pointed in the Didache is that the people who participate, they actually are baptized. So it is interesting because it looks like the focus there is the body of Christ, is the church. That is the focus of the Lord's Supper celebration, is a celebration of the body of Christ, the church, the community of believers. Of course, the Didache is not an inspired document, but it does show how it was celebrated in the early times of the church.
I like it. And to follow that through, my sort of facetious question about lamb or not, it would seem that since Jesus, we celebrate now being with us after the resurrection, having tofurkey would be just fine, right?
It could be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald.
Pastor, George, I'm going to ask you to unmute. While I'm doing that, I'm going to ask Pastor another question that one of our members has posed. Pastor, would you be kind enough to once again reiterate the distinction between sacrament and ordinance in the context of your presentation?
Yeah. So that was a question from me to you, but I think the basic difference is that so the sacramental view of the rites is a Catholic development throughout history. So when one is baptized, uh, you receive grace from God. You receive charis, this grace from God, simply by the act of baptism. So the act itself is a guarantee that one is blessed, that one receives grace. And the same is applied and the same is believed by Catholics nowadays also with regard to the Lord's Supper. So as one takes part in the Lord's Supper and eats and drinks, you receive grace from God as well. Now, that was the discussion in the Reformation. So the Catholics believe in transubstantiation. So the elements they are transformed into the body and the blood of Jesus. The Lutherans protested and they believe in consubstantiation. I was reading about that, and it's interesting because Lutherans find the definition horrible, but that is actually what they agreed back then. So the elements are connected with, but they do not become the literal body and blood of Jesus. Actually, the Catholic stance is very strong. So for a Catholic, the bread becomes literally the body of Jesus, and the wine becomes literally Saint blood. Although, so the only thing the Catholics say is that the appearance does not change, but the content, it becomes the literal body and the literal blood of Jesus. And then the Protestant, there was also a third group, which is the Adventist group, which is the memorialists. So they do not believe in transubstantiation or consubstantiation, but we should do it in order to remember, or because it was ordained. And that is fine, because as we look in the Bible, for instance, that was actually the reason why God commanded his people to celebrate the feasts. So it was to remember, to look back. But we do not have an indication. So the first Israelites that were delivered from slavery in Egypt, they did receive a direct blessing by being delivered from death. But the following generations, they were to look back to remember. But I was not, so to say, the celebration of Passover for the Jews was not sacramental in the sense that it was a means of grace. It was a memorial for them. So I think the memorial view of celebrating is fine. The problem is in practice, because if it was memorial in the sense that we actually have an actual meal, it was okay. But the fact that the meal is symbolic, it becomes very ritual. And because it becomes very ritual, although we say it is an ordinance, it feels as if it is a sacrament. So that's how I perceive it. So we say it is an ordinance, it is memorial, but because we inherited the Catholic way of celebration, which is very ritualistic, it fails as a sacrament for us. In fact, I was reading the chapter 72 of The Desire of Ages, and Ellen G. White uses the word sacrament 5 times when she refers to the Lord's Supper. However, I also read an article, and the article points out that when Ellen G. White refers to the Lord's Supper as a sacrament, she's not referring to the symbols, but to the presence of Christ. And that's interesting because the Catholics do believe that Christ is present in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. He is indeed sacrificed, he is crucified. This is why they say in the Catholic Church, Jesus is crucified every Mass. Mass means sacrifice. And Ellen G. White actually says that Jesus is present as we celebrate the Lord's Supper. And for her, it is the presence of Jesus that makes the Lord's Supper a sacrament. So that's the difference, because for the Catholics, it is the elements, but for Ellen G. White, it is the presence of Jesus.
Well, and it makes me think too that we describe foot washing, we have historically, as the ordinance of humility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The difference, but look, the difference is, in my experience, people do not see the foot washing as sacramental,
No.
but they do see the bread and the wine as sacramental. At least in my experience.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
this is some food for thought, something to think about.
Yes. Yes. And thank you. Thank you for that clarification. George, it's wonderful to see you today. Tell us what you are thinking.
The same here. Nice being here. Yeah, regarding what Jerry's just said a minute ago, I'm a vegetarian too. I like tofurkey, but I would be glad to take once a year, sit down with Jerry and eat some lamb while he eats the tofurkey. Pastor Reis, thank you so much for this presentation. It was so interesting. Actually, when we think about the Lord's Supper, it should be a remembrance of Him. And I wonder how many of us have real remembrance of at least the ceremonies that we participated in our lives. I honestly, I don't remember any but one. And the only one that I remember is the one
Well, I lost George.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll get him back. So I'll keep a watch for him. So, Lauren, why don't you unmute and go ahead, and we'll plug George back in.
Glad to. The just to go back what I said before, Marcel, the process of preventing a whole group of people from taking communion is called interdict or interdiction, and you can look that up. The last interdiction, I believe, happened in the 1950s when a parish in Louisiana refused to allow a black priest, and their bishop put them under interdict, which meant that nobody could receive communion. And furthermore, they could no longer even be buried. If somebody died, they couldn't be buried in sacred ground. And that was something that really bothered a lot of people. There was an interdiction in Malta in the 1930s where everybody who voted for a particular political party was placed under interdict. And so, yeah, it's been used as to add a little bit more to what the question was that somebody asked through Linda. Those who believe in the sacraments also believe that when Jesus said, "This is my body and this is my blood," that they actually became, in some way, bread. Bread became flesh, and wine became blood. And when people said, "Yeah, but it doesn't look like blood or flesh," the fathers of the church said, "Well, yeah, it doesn't look like it, but spiritually it is. And if you could actually see it through spiritual eyes, you would actually have a chunk of flesh laying there, and you would have blood in the cup." And the Catholics take that to a ridiculous extent. And I'm not knocking Catholics here. I've been very vocal about Seventh-day Adventists putting Roman Catholics down, but even Roman Catholics and others in this school realize that it can get a little strange when you take a piece of bread and put it inside of a holder where you can look at it and everybody comes and prays to that piece of bread because it is a piece of Jesus' body. I'm fine with the sacramental religions for the most part. I'm not knocking them. Some of that stuff though just gets too weird for me. I'm not mystical enough to believe that Jesus' body is now sitting in a fancy little golden holder, and I should pray to it. So more hands have come up, but I'll just finish one more thing that I wanted to say. I don't know if any of you know this, that speaking, people say, why are those Catholics and Episcopalians so ritualistic? Well, Marcelo, just try to change anything that goes on in an Adventist church and tell people, yeah, we're going to change this completely. I tried doing different things with communion, and oh my goodness, the uproar that no, you cannot change that. That is how we've always done it. So ritual, I mean, we've got rituals. Let's be perfectly honest here. We do rituals, and we have to be a little careful about how we speak about other people's rituals when we have rituals of our own. That's all I want to say.
That's true. I agree. Just to mention also, I'm not here to attack Catholics. I do believe sometimes we talk too much about
Absolutely.
them. But actually, when we talk about the Lord's Supper, what many of us do not realize is that we have inherited a lot from Catholics in the way we celebrate the Lord's Supper.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And at least you have to say for them that they take it very seriously, in some ways more seriously than some Protestants.
Exactly. Thomas, I don't want you to go away, but he just did. But I'm coming to George first because we lost him and now he's found. So, George, pick up where you left off.
I'm sorry, I have no idea what happened. Yeah, I was saying that the one ceremony that I remember is when in 94, 95, Smuts van Rooyen was a pastor in Riverside, California at Hurupa Church. We had one Friday night, one Lord's Supper was a big table, huge table in U-shaped in a social room. And we sat down and we had plenty of bread. We had grapes and jars with grape juice and candles. Everything was in the dark with candles. It was the most beautiful and the only one ceremony that I remember in all my life. So I can see the value of what you just compared about the real meal and just a symbol. I participated in many symbolic, acts in my life, many of them at my age, but only one I have in my mind is the one that had kind of a major meal. I really appreciated your presentation. Thank you for the time you spent researching this and presenting it. God bless you.
Yes,
Thank you
thank you.
very much for your comment, George.
Yes, I'm sure that George speaks for all of us in that regard. Thomas, I've asked you to unmute, and you have. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Share your thoughts with us today.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate this this service right now. For me, it is a service. This seminar. I, especially for myself, I have bad thoughts about the Lord's Supper because in my early youth time in church and also as a children in our church, the Lord's Supper service always was with a depressed atmosphere. With I don't know, the music was depressing. The services was very sad, and later the people in church they had fighting about the right way for the Lord's Supper, because we changed from big cups to small glass cups for everybody, and there was a big fight in our church about, and I have negative thoughts about such services. And another thing is, I was around 15 or 16 years old, young, and was not baptized. We had renovated our church. We painted it inside and built some new wardrobe inside. And I, as a youth boy, unbaptized, I touched the holy tools and put it out of the wardrobe to another place, and the old guy saw it, and he went to the pastor and he said, wow, this was a very big sin for Thomas to touch this tools. It's not allowed. Yeah. And for me till now, now I'm 58 years old, till now the Lord's Supper service have a negative feeling. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I believe it's the experience of many, Thomas. The problem is many people believe it should be celebrated in a certain way. And if you do not celebrate in a certain way with a certain spirit, then you commit a sin. The problem is in the texts we read in Acts, so the Lord's Supper was a meal of fellowship. And it even says in Acts 2:46 or 47, if I'm not mistaken, that they enjoyed themselves with gladness and thankfulness. So they were happy as they were celebrating that communion meal. They were not depressed. It was not heavily ritualistic. I do not say that there was nothing ritualistic. Perhaps, as we see in the Didache, there was a moment of praying for the food and thanking for the food afterwards. But it was not as ritualistic and liturgical as it is for us nowadays.
Oh, okay. Thomas is giving applause. Okay, he's appreciating it. Okay, thank you for your question, Thomas. Paul, I'm going to ask you to unmute. We're glad you're here. today?
Yes. This might appear as kind of a stupid question, but in John chapter 6, verse 54, it says, truly, truly, I say unto you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Then in verse 63 of the same chapter, it says, it is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak unto you are spirit and are life. Now, I interpret that as a connection between Scripture and the eating and drinking of Christ's flesh and blood. My question is there a connection between these texts and the communion that we practice at church?
Yeah, it is actually a very good question. Indeed, John chapter 6, it is the strongest passage that the Catholic Church use for the theology of transubstantiation. But most theologians disagree that actually what Jesus there is not talking about yet what he would say later in the Last Supper. So we know the context of John chapter 6, it's the multiplication of the fish and the bread. And then people come next day again, and Jesus gets upset because they are coming after him for more food. And that's when he starts to compare himself with the manna, which came from heaven. And then he talks there about his body and his blood, and it sounds very much about like the words he used in the Last Supper. But the text you read later in the chapter, and also the reply from Peter, which comes later, it actually reveals that he's talking about the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. And the context of the whole chapter is actually faith in Jesus. This eating the flesh and drinking of the blood is actually believing in the words and in the teachings of Jesus. That's what Peter says. Where shall we go? Only you have the words of eternal life. So the words of Jesus are what actually give us eternal life. And that's the meaning of eating his body and drinking of his blood. So most theologians, Catholic, Protestant theologians, they would say that is not related to the theology of the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper. That is actually about faith, what Jesus is describing there.
Well, wouldn't the Lord's Supper also be about faith?
Yes. It is definitely about faith, especially but here just to define, I this from the presentation, what I attempted to show is that perhaps the texts that talk about the Lord's Supper and the breaking of bread are not about faith, because the focus and the emphasis of that meal was communion. But I do believe that Christians, the early church, when they met to celebrate Passover, that they did rethink about the significance of Jesus' sacrifice and so on. And in that sense, yes, I do believe that it was about faith in Jesus' blood and Jesus' body. And it made sense. Imagine Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper with the disciples, and they are used in the Seder meal to eat bread and drink of the cup as a symbol of liberation from slavery. And then Jesus applies that to himself, the bread and the wine. So it made sense because it was a big jubileum, a big liberation that God was working through Jesus. But again, that is in the context of the Passover. The texts that talk about the Lord's Supper and the breaking of bread in the New Testament does not seem to indicate that that liturgy was followed in the communion meals. But at least that's my personal interpretation, and I do respect the Lord's Supper in our churches. My issue is actually with the symbolic meal. This is for me my biggest struggle with the way we celebrate. But I still would make a case that we should celebrate it once a year with the symbols, the bread and the wine. But if we have to celebrate it every quarter, I wouldn't have a problem as long as we would have an actual meal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Your question was really quite provocative. I appreciate it very much. Gina, I see you're in the brass section today. Gina, I know you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Can you make sure your microphone is on? There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to respond to a funny thing first about Lauren's comment about turning the body of the bread into the body of Jesus. There was a book that was popular in the United States in the 1990s called Angela's Ashes. And it was autobiographical. And the boy was talking about his first Holy Communion and what a big deal it was in Ireland, where he grew up. And he took communion, and then he was so amped up about the whole thing that he ended up throwing up. And so he goes and tells his grandmother, I threw up Jesus in the backyard. And there's this huge conundrum about what to do about this. And his grandmother's like, you need to go to confession. You need to tell the priest that you threw up Jesus in the backyard. So he goes into the confessional booth, and he's confessing this, and he can hear this shaking kind of laughing of the priest in the confessional booth about, okay, maybe we've taken this too far, was my read on it. So that was kind of funny. But I wanted to talk about the Passover meal. My son is married to a Jewish woman, and they have a ritual, and I wondered if this is something you could incorporate into your meal. There's something they call Didache, where they say these things about all the things that God has done for them. So Passover, they're commemorating the Passover of Egypt and the deliverance of the Israelites from slavery. And they talk about, the first one says, if God would have taken us out of Egypt and not executed judgment upon them, it would have been enough for us. And then they say Didache. And then they say, if he would have executed judgment upon them, but not upon their idols, it would have been enough for us. Didache. So they go through this whole ritual about the things that God did for them, ending up with, they were in the wilderness, but even if he hadn't provided the manna, it would have been enough for them. And just the idea of being grateful for what you get from God and not asking for more really touches my heart. So that's something I like about the Passover service, the ritualisticness of it. And I like that Didache prayer. The other thing I wanted to say, just about the communion that I've experienced in mostly the Adventist church, but not exclusively in the Adventist church, is I think the important thing is the sense of community. And I think it's an opportunity for Christians to realize that there is a fellowship there where they support each other, they encourage each other. And when you think about the bride of Christ, the church being the bride of Christ, I think that is what he likes, is that we're all there together and we're all propping each other up. And that's how we're going to get through it. I think we tend to complicate Christianity too much and almost idolatry to symbolism and rituals. But I like the idea, if it were my vote that counted, which it doesn't, I would have communion every week because I think it emphasizes the community of believers that I think should be emphasized every week. But the foot washing, I'm not so crazy about. But I do see the value in it, in humility, creating humility and making us humble. So that's all I have to say.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Lauren, before I come to you and Marlon, I just want to share an experience myself and have Pastor Reis comment on it. This is a pretty far-flung group, and I imagine that most people actually either do attend a church nearby or have access to a church nearby. But during the pandemic, the Sabbath school, adult Sabbath school class to which I belong, began to meet remotely by Zoom. And we have continued to do that. And most of us are in this area of Florida where I live, not all, but we felt a wish to have communion service. My question really is going to have to do with the issue of officiating. And so on a Sabbath, when some of our out-of-towners were going to be in town, we thought about it carefully and actually read a fine article in Adventist Today. And we decided that we would have our own communion service. No one in our group is an elder. No one in our group is a pastor. And so I bought foil casserole pans at the dollar store to use for the foot washing and got some nice paper napkins. And I made the communion bread, which was an unmitigated disaster. I have to tell you, I'm surprised people didn't break teeth on it. But we asked one couple because we were meeting in their home that day, if they would put like a liturgy together. And so we had a simple but very wonderful service, and we had our communion, and then we had a big Mexican potluck. And so my question, I see you not sort of nodding, is it all right to do that in your mind? Do the sacraments or the ordinances require someone of a certain stature in the church, or did we do right, would you say?
Not really, Linda. And actually, as we look back, the Jews, when they celebrated the Passover, it was celebrated in the family, this in the household. So there was not a priest in every household. There was not a Levite in every household. So people actually should make the arrangements themselves to celebrate that. And yeah, once again, we go back. The meal was actual. It was real meal.
We did. Yes.
But of course, it had a symbol. So I'm not against the symbolism, as I said. The problem is, just like in that last sentence, the meal was substantial and it has a symbol, but then we turned it into a symbolic meal with a substantial symbol. So we can actually turn around things and make the symbol too big.
That's
and
what
then
we felt like we felt
the
like
meal.
that it did that for us, that it moved us more to the communal and away from the pure ritualistic. It was a very touching
Yes.
service for us.
It just like baptism as well. I do believe we can baptize each other. So it is not required to be a pastor. It's because we have institutionalized many things in church, but as we read the Bible, actually, it was not like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the affirmation. I appreciate it. So, Lauren, you can unmute yourself. We'll come to you. And did you want to say a word about next week while we're here?
Yeah, let me mention again. The teacher is one of my favorite writers uh, for Adventist today. Interesting guy. I've always said I want to. He lives in Perth, Australia, and it's unlikely I'll ever go to Perth in my life. But I really want to meet Stephen Ferguson. He is an interesting chap, and he's going to be teaching for us next week because he's over in France, and so he's taken some of his time to come and teach. And he's going to be talking about something kind of related here. He's going to discuss our understanding of things and services and such being holy. So that should be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to it. He's written an article about it, and he's going to take off from that. I was laughing to myself, Linda, about your experiments making communion bread. We've had various kinds of communion bread through the years, and some of them are better than others. Some of them were actually good. But a few years ago, they placed a recipe for communion bread in the church manual. And then one of the divisions, who had their own section of the church manual, placed their own recipe for communion bread in the church manual. Can't remember which one it was. And somebody wrote, now, since we've got that in the church, does this mean that only Jesus, the only kind of communion bread that we can use is going to be the recipe that's in the church manual? Do we have to ask people, did you make this according to the church recipe or didn't you? Because that's going to depend on whether we're having a real communion service or not. I thought that was hilarious when this person asked me that. But just so you know, Linda, you can find a recipe in the church manual.
Well, I went and looked for one, but I didn't have access to the church manual. I just Googled it. So anyway, I think the problem was not in the instructions. It was probably in the execution.
Yeah, but the person making the body of Jesus.
Exactly.
Uh, yeah, but let me ask you another thing. Oh, and by the way, on that same topic, I had in one church we used loaves of bread. Now, some people were very uncomfortable with that because they said it has to be unleavened. I couldn't quite figure that out. This is a Christian dispensation, Marcelo, and we should be able to use leavened bread now. It's unleavened bread was for the Jews. We're Christians. Anyway, there's something I wanted to really to get your background on. You mentioned in passing with those pictures, those photos. You mentioned or photos of the paintings that have been discovered, the fish and the bread, and you didn't really develop it fully, but I found that fascinating. We're having the Lord's Supper, but we're also celebrating the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, possibly. Is that what you were trying to did somehow this merge and mesh somewhere along the way?
Yeah, it could be an overlap, because the interesting thing about the paintings is that on the one hand, they portray the multiplication of the fish and the bread, but because there is also a cup on the table, and there was not a cup, and they are sitting around the table. So it looks like the Christians who did that painting, they were meshing actually both, because they were not just describing the miracle with the baskets and so on. They were also depicting a gathering around the table, which is very much connected with communion, the Lord's Supper, and the breaking of bread. Um, and the idea there was to show that actually how the way they celebrated it was with abundance of food, and there was extra food. So not just the bread and the cup, but also fish.
Mm. And
Because
there's nothing in the Passover service about fish.
Yeah, and also look, when we read the Gospels, um, we only also read about the bread and the wine, but there was other elements. There was a lamb as well. There was the bitter herbs and other elements that are not mentioned, but they were part of the meal. So my issue with the way we celebrate nowadays is that we have, to some extent, impoverished the meal.
Yeah.
That we can just have this or that. And the problem is, it's not that we just can have bread and wine. It is the small quantity of both, which
Yeah.
we actually, according to Paul, it is wrong to be hungry after you celebrate. Paul says some go drunk and others go hungry. The thing is, we are all going home hungry after we celebrate the Lord's Supper, which for Paul, I believe if Paul would come to our churches nowadays, they would say the same thing. He says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. So it would not change very much.
Yeah.
His critique that he made to the church in Corinth to ours nowadays.
Interesting concept.
I don't know if you know this, Marcelo, but if you've ever been in a Catholic church where they use a tiny little wafer that is almost like styrofoam, it's a very, very light. One of the arguments for that is that you're not supposed to chew on Jesus. You lay it on the person's tongue and let it dissolve. So you're not doing damage to Jesus' body. This is something I was told once.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let me come to Marlon. Welcome. You're going to be our last word today.
That's an honor. Listen, I think that we miss, as Adventists, because that's the only context I can talk about. As Adventists, we miss something that I think it's even more important than the texture of the bread or the wine, whether it was alcoholic or non-alcoholic, whatever the case might be. Because in that passage in Luke 20, verse 20, right? It says, and likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. I think that is even more important than what bread is like, what the wine is like, because it seems like what Jesus is really doing is inaugurating the new covenant and moving the folks out of the old covenant system into the new covenant. And we do this every quarter and speak nothing about the new covenant and how you live under the new covenant compared to how you lived under the old covenant. That's why in Adventism you have this hodgepodge of old covenant requirements being forced on people, and you speak to the average Adventist, and they will tell you the new covenant is the old covenant written on your heart, right? So we miss that whole thing that Jesus was inaugurating a new covenant in the body of Christ. I came in late, so maybe you guys covered that before, but that's one of my little pet peeves, when we have communion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much,
Reis.
Marlon.
Well, and let me just say, Marlon, I'm so glad you said that, because it's one of my pet peeves too, not so much tied to communion, but tied to the fact that that's the only covenant that Jesus made with us in the New Testament. It's the only one. And we do forget that. We do ignore that.
How many of us know how do you live under the new covenant?
We don't spend enough time talking about that. You're exactly right. I thank you. I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Well, Pastor Reis, I just want to share one last thing with you that you might consider seeing if you can find it and incorporating it, if you wish, into your lovely presentation. I had occasion many years ago to go to Peru. And in the course of that, was able to go up to Cusco, where is the entry point to go up ultimately to Machu Picchu. And in Cusco, there is a beautiful cathedral, a Catholic cathedral, and it's open to tourists. And I was there with my daughter, and we went in. And if you could get a photograph of this, oh my goodness, there is a painting there. It must be 15 feet high and probably 30 or 40 feet long. It's huge. It's just monolithic. It is so big. And it's a painting of the Last Supper. And the story that's told about it is that when the Spaniards came in, and conscripted the local people, they forced them to paint this Christian painting, which the locals did, and they did the best they could, except that when the food is laid out, instead of the fish, what's on the painting are what's called cuy. Do you know what cuy is? They're guinea pigs.
Guinea pigs.
And they eat them there. They're part of the food supply. And so here on this big platter are the loaves and the cuy with their feet up in the air because they're dead and they've been cooked. It's pretty wild to look at, and it's not ancient like your wonderful paintings, but I think the indigenous folks just got the last word on that. They said we're going to do this our way if you're going to force us into a Christian ceremony here. But Pastor,
Interesting. I'm going to look this up.
It's yes, I'm sure you can find it because it is just so huge. But you can see from the conversation how intriguing and interesting your presentation has been to us. You've opened ideas and thoughts that we had not considered, and given us so very much to think about. And for that, we are grateful. We appreciate it today. So, Lauren, I'm going to turn it back to you.
I just wanted to say there's been an interesting discussion going on in the chat about during the pandemic, we had an online communion because we were assuming a lot of people weren't going to church. So we did an online communion. And a lot of people found it very meaningful. And we would want to do it, I suppose, in the symbolic sense, since we can't really sit down and eat with one another in this setting, and we'd have to skip the foot washing. But maybe we need to have Marcelo come back and lead us in an online communion again sometime, because a lot of people felt it was very meaningful.